Welcome to the Intention Podcast. I'm Byron DeLear. Well, this week we find ourselves in what the Surgeon General calls America's 9/11 or Pearl Harbor moment. Records are being broken all over the place in terms of total deaths per day. More than 1,800 people perished yesterday, and 13,000 Americans have died due to coronavirus infection. This may not even be an accurate total because of the lack of testing. So we are in very, very tragic times, and it's important to stay connected, to press in, and that's what this conversation is all about. This is my second episode of Intention, and again, I'm going to focus on the asteroid hit impact of the coronavirus crisis, how it's impacted our culture, economy, our lives. I've invited a dear friend of mine and business partner to join me in this conversation. Tom Appelbaum is an attorney, geologist, and clean energy executive. We both started energy equity funding 10 years ago to develop programs to advance the deployment of energy efficiency and clean energy technology throughout the Midwest. In our conversation today, we review the president's crisis management style and various conspiracies that seem to still be floating around. In fact, there's really been an epidemic of disinformation out there. We also discuss the impact that this has had on political campaigns and public policy. Tom's an attorney for St. Louis County, and he's been dealing with the COVID-19 crisis directly. And in bringing some historical thought experiments to the table, we explore how George Washington would fight the virus war and how that compares to what we're doing today. So without delay, here's episode 2 of Intention, how General Washington would fight the virus war and how Trump mismanaged it. Here we are, the Intention Podcast. I'm Byron DeLear, and I have with me Tom Appelbaum. Now, Tom, you and I, we both live and work in St. Louis County, and we've been business partners in the past.
Yep.
We helped kick off a clean energy program in Missouri.
That's right.
That program's financed now about almost 3,000 projects for $150 million. And it's created or retained over 2,000 good paying jobs in the clean energy industry. And that includes electricians, heating and cooling technicians, carpenters, insulators, plumbers, pipe fitters. And I think that some estimates show that the projects that have been done under this program currently will account for the reduction of approximately 300,000 tons of pollution.
That's right. I remember crunching those numbers.
Yeah. And the Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, which is what it's called, doesn't cost taxpayers a single dime. And, I had the great experience of building a little company with you and selling it to the national market leader in PACE in 2017. And you were the best man at my wedding.
That's right. Our paths are pretty well intertwined. But yeah, that was a really good program. I was very proud of that. It took a lot of persistence to help it get traction, particularly in the Midwest marketplace. But yeah, we hung in there and were able to get it done. And we've gotten something going that I think we both should be proud of.
Yeah, and you're still working in the PACE industry, as am I. You are currently administering some programs in Illinois, and I'm doing work here in the Midwest and also doing some legislative work on clean energy in California. But, we find ourselves in harrowing times. I started this podcast a week ago, and my first guest was a guy named James Owen, another fellow Missourian who works in the clean energy industry. And we talked about the current coronavirus crisis. And it's interesting because even just as soon as a week ago, the numbers are just continuing to skyrocket. A week ago, there had been 500 deaths in one day.
Right.
90% of the country is under a stay-at-home order, or 90% of the population, essentially. And there have been, over 350,000 coronavirus cases in the United States, with nearly 11,000 deaths. For the last 6 days since I recorded the podcast with James, each day about 1,000 people have died. I mean, this is
right.
This is very, very serious.
Yeah, I mean, I think the the time of anybody claiming that the media is overblowing this, or that certain sectors of the politics are overblowing this. I think that's kind of done. As a matter of fact, I think that we're kind of entering the phase where people are being very intentional about certain things, that some of which may even go too far. I think that what we're experiencing, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so happy to be chatting with you now, is that we're in the middle of a trauma. There's been a lot of analogies like 9/11 or something like that, or wartime footing or something. But right now, it's like a slow moving 9/11. And we have an opportunity, while we're trying to deal with an incredibly dynamic situation, to kind of think from an intentional standpoint, what are things going to look like coming out of here? I think both you and I like to look at things from a very strategic perspective. We like to try to think, a step or two ahead, what's going to be the impact of this. Mm-hmm. As you're watching these things kind of game out with regards to public policy, I'm constantly thinking, what are we going to look like when we come out of this?
Yeah, and you see a lot of minimization and denial, and conspiracies are still running rampant. I've seen pushback on the stay-at-home orders from people and even political leaders comparing COVID-19 to the flu, and
right,
or repeating the unfortunate slogan, the cure is worse than the problem.
Yeah.
We heard that initially from Trump, mm-hmm. but I think about where we're going to head after this, and I'd like to table that for just a minute, because I raised the issue of how the president has been dealing with this crisis. And in my conversation a week ago with James, I was pretty charitable, considering with the president, because we had just seen him turn the corner and seem to face the music on the science and projections, well, at least in contrast to how he had been saying it was a hoax, or that, 15 cases are soon going to be 10, and then 5, and then 0. I mean, these are the kind of things that he was saying in February. And it seemed like he'd turned the corner and was embracing some of the metrics and projections that Dr. Birx and Fauci were offering him. I feel like the old Trump is back.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of an extraordinary situation before the global pandemic, where we have a president that has really no problem contradicting himself, not just from one day to the next, but, literally sometimes from one sentence to the next. So, and his lack of ability to kind of think strategically, I think, has presented this kind of deer in the headlights response to a lot of this. So yeah, him changing course, like doing a 180 from one day to the next, that has only been heightened by how dynamic the situation's been and how dire it's been. And there's been a lot of talk about these daily press briefings kind of like supplanting his rallies as far as maintaining the spotlight on himself.
Well, it seems like he wants to try to fix the problem with reality TV show programming, as opposed to actually jumping in and doing what he needs to do. And there's a deep irony here. I mean, I raised this in the first episode, which is, we've always heard about how Trump has these autocratic and dictatorial impulses, and yet this entire time he has been backpedaling and running away from wrapping his arms around this crisis and doing what he needs to do as a wartime president.
Right, exactly. And I mean, this is one of those moments where it's like, well, thank God he doesn't think that strategically, because, that would seem like a logical move if he was thinking like long game at all. But he's not. And that's where the whole deer in the headlights thing comes into play from my perspective. And I'm not saying that to pile on the guy. This is an observation, because like you said, the 180 degree turns from one day to the next. It's pretty remarkable,
right?
I mean, it keeps the media entertained, keeps the media focused on him, and keeps them talking about something other than some of the things that maybe we should be talking about, which is, what was done wrong, what could have been done better, what should we be doing right now. We've got issues with our medical supply chain, coming up with protective equipment for healthcare workers. What about some of these policy changes? We're not having that conversation now that I think we probably should be having. The CDC came out and said that we should wear masks when we're out in public. Well, at the same time, saying that there's no proof that helps. There's anecdotal, you could think, well, it's going to prevent you from touching your face as much. But the presentation, at least, given the fact that it went from saying, you don't have to wear a mask out in public to saying that, yeah, you should wear a mask out in public. I understand it's a dynamic situation, constantly changing, but it was kind of one of those things where it's like, well, it's not going to hurt, so you might as well.
It just seems like a big Keystone Cops routine.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, these are the guys, the CDC is supposed to be completely non-political, but we've seen the politics kind of touch all kinds of sectors in the federal government that normally wouldn't be touched. So, I think about there's lots of things that came out of 9/11 that I question whether or not it was reactionary and not very well thought through. And, I'm concerned that that's going to happen with this too, because we are dealing with the trauma. And the thing about this pandemic is it's the oddest thing that any of us have gone through, and we're all going through it together. So if you stop and think about, wrapping your brain around that, it's going to change how we interact as people.
In Missouri, we've had 39 deaths, 2,722 known cases. There's 1,000 cases in St. Louis County. And, you're an attorney for St. Louis County and you're dealing with this issue.
Right.
There's about 470 people that are hospitalized locally. In Illinois, there's been 307 deaths and 12,300 confirmed cases. And locally here in the St. Louis area, 92 in St. Clair County, 52 in Madison County, and 11 in Monroe County, according to the State Department of Health. I'm thinking about some of the pushback against the executive order that Governor Mike Parson issued for Missouri, where he finally issued a stay-at-home order. Now, we had seen the stay-at-home order issued in the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County and St. Charles County much earlier. But I've seen some of the political pushback, and it kind of revolves around, hey, you're violating my constitutional rights. I have the freedom to go to church. I have the freedom to do what I want to do. In fact, I saw some letter that was going around saying that because of the Missouri state motto of Salus Populi Suprema Lex Esto, which means the welfare of the people shall be the supreme law. Therefore, I am a member of the populace. Therefore, I have the supreme political power constitutionally. Therefore, I have the right to be able to go out and do whatever I want. And people are signing this letter. And so I think about some of that pushback, and they're basically equating this crisis to the flu.
Mm-hmm.
And the situation, just for the purposes of level setting and getting this out there for the audience, the situation is so entirely different. I mean, we're waging a war against an unseen enemy that we know nothing about. And we know everything about the flu. We know when it rises seasonally. We know when it reduces seasonally. We've got weapons to fight against the flu. We've got therapies. We've got vaccines. It's a wholly different situation. And, I was thinking about how the Great Disappearing Act that the president has been engaging in, albeit except for his reality TV show press conferences that he's doing, which a Republican colleague told me is must-see TV, But I was thinking, what would George Washington have done during this crisis? And I know that
right.
sounds somewhat, out of context historically and a little, perhaps rhetorical, and it is rhetorical, but, hear me out. So I was thinking about what George Washington would do to fight the coronavirus, and the idea, and as you know, Tom, I've written a book about the American Revolution, the first American flag. And so I've read all the primary sources at that time and have really had the opportunity to live with some of the at least written ideas and concepts of the founders and framers of the Republic, and in particular, the careful, calculating, and cautious demeanor of General Washington. But the idea of the American Fabius came to mind. What is that? Washington was called the American Fabius because of a Roman general that used delaying tactics in warfare. That Roman general was Fabius Maximus, and he would later become known as the father of guerrilla warfare, so to speak. And guerrilla warfare is hit and run tactics. You don't face the enemy in an open battle, in an open field, trying to engage in some sort of decisive battle. In other words, you're not engaging in all-out full battles on the open field, but rather you're using hit and run tactics. And this was a chief strategy that Washington used to win the American war. Using that Fabian strategy allowed General Washington to preserve his forces and flatten the curve. I mean, that's what Washington would do to fight the coronavirus. He'd want to wait and delay until there were more favorable conditions to win. And that exactly matches the strategy that we are deploying now. When you think about it,
right,
what we're trying to do is we're trying to stop the exponential spread of the virus so that we can have more weapons and prepare the battlefield for how we want to fight the battle, which means having therapeutic responses to the virus and having vaccines and also having a hospital system that hasn't been overwhelmed so that people that do get the virus and get really desperately ill can get the treatment that they deserve instead of having to participate in a whole triage nightmare hospital system. I mean, I don't know if you've seen some of the videos from these doctors in New York.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a war zone.
Absolutely, yeah. And when people start seeing the numbers, they're like, well, only a certain percentage go to the hospital of those. A smaller percentage actually get really sick. But part of the issue with that is that if you look at historically, what epidemiologists have, the numbers are shocking. Like you said, it's not the flu. It's mortality rates way higher. And then, of course, we're learning more and more about this virus all the time. But yeah, that's a great analogy, actually, because it is about trying to draw this out. And I think that Dr. Fauci is that he's right there with it. I mean, that's really what they're trying to do because that's all they can do right now. Like you said, if you're in a war zone, if you're running low on supplies, if you're waiting for, the artillery to come, you have to hold your position or, it's over.
I think that if we had a commander in chief that had a comprehensive understanding of strategy, he would see clearly this strategy and fully commit to it. And that's not what we have. We
Right.
don't have a leader that has a penetrating perception of battlefield strategy. Or, I mean, there's other analogies. You could use sports analogies. You could use academic analogies, to be
Right.
sure. But once you understand what the strategy is trying to do, you make your plan, you work your plan. I mean, this is what we learn in business, right? You make your strategic business plan and then you work your plan. And that's not what we have. I mean, I feel like the president and his coterie, including the vice president, they totally look like deer in the headlights up there in these press conferences. They have no idea where this thing is going, and they're not committing. I mean, wouldn't it be great if Schwarzkopf was put in charge of this?
Right, exactly. And I mean, the military is actually designed to deal with the scope of this much better than any other organization. But yeah, I mean, to your point about the thinking strategically, in the first couple of days when Trump was up there saying that, oh, it's not a problem, it's, it'll be 15, it'll be down to none soon and all that. I mean, I know what he was trying to do there because that was with the backdrop of the Dow dropping precipitously. And he was trying to give optimism to people, which is important for a leader to do, to not be pushing fear in any way, shape, or form. And I understand that. The problem is that the way he was doing it was he was just trying to make people believe that for that day because he knew that would be proven to be a ridiculous statement.
Well, he's such a day trader.
Exactly.
And if he's going to try to quell people's fears and talk about the light at the end of the tunnel and be optimistic, it needs to be substantive. It needs to be backed with substance.
Right. And you have to underscore the importance of it because that's the only thing in the face of something like this that's going to really give people reassurances.
that there's a leader in charge that isn't, a deer in headlights with this. It's got to resonate as strong leadership. I mean, you can look back at some of the trying times that we've had as a country. You can look back at some of the great leaders. The thing that jumps out are things that actually happened that we've had to deal with. You could look at other potential pandemics that didn't happen. And I mean, that's the mark of success in dealing with the pandemic. It's kind of like if all of this social distancing and all the stay-at-home orders, if they all work, then you know that the people that were complaining about it are going to come back and they're going to say, see, it wasn't that big of a deal after all. Because when your strategy works, it flattens the curve, less people are dying, it's not hitting you all at once, and you don't have those horrific scenes of bodies being loaded into refrigerator trucks.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And so, you talk about the reduction of the loss of life, and I think that it's important to depict what those numbers are. If we had just treated this like it's the flu, and made some suggestions about social distancing, about physical distancing, and not really done a comprehensive lockdown. Now, to be sure, the kind of lockdown that we have in America is nothing like what they're able to accomplish in China because of all the freedoms and independent-minded culture that we have here, and the decentralization of our federalist political system. I mean, we've got all these different little fiefdoms, governors, 50 states, etc. So, but I think it's important to articulate what the numbers would actually translate to. The difference could be 800,000 lives if the worst models were true.
Right.
Because if you don't halt the speedy spread, that will see millions of Americans getting corona very quickly, overwhelming our hospital system, forcing the healthcare fight to occur without any proven treatments or vaccines. And that would result in 1 million lives lost. And, there's been various studies and unpacking of the data to date, which shows that the lethality rate of the coronavirus is probably somewhere between 0.5% to about 2%, 3%. I mean, some of the numbers coming out of Italy and Spain are like 4 and 5%. And I think the global numbers are in the 4 or 5% range when you look at all the casualties versus the number of cases that have been recorded. In America, I think it's hovering around 1.5% of cases that have been recorded as contrasted with the actual deaths. But if 2% of the people die, and there's a reproduction number of R2 to R3, meaning that there's an exponential spread of the virus.
Right.
I mean, that could possibly indicate that 100 million Americans would be infected, basically a third of the population, and that would translate into 1 million lives lost. But on the other hand, if we do this Fabian, George Washington strategy of backpedaling and trying to prepare the battlefield that's most preferential to us, then you see that, you shut down the spread in the short term. This allows for the deployment of more weapons. And that could mean potentially, if we do all the right steps, that could mean 200,000 lives lost. So you're talking about a delta of 800,000 lives. And so the question becomes, is it worthwhile to pause our economy, the wealth and footprint of the American economy in terms of its financial system and its ability to be able to issue trillions of dollars of debt, to be able to take such a broad stroke as halting and pausing the economy is something that's actually doable. It's one of our heritages as a country. So you engage that. And the question becomes, is the cure worse than the problem? I don't think so. I think the cure is less problematic than the issue of losing hundreds of thousands of American lives.
Well, right. And, like you said, we're working to flatten the curve. It's not like we could just ignore it. So the impact's going to be there. And, the only way that we're going to get back to anything resembling normal is by fighting this thing. It's like in World War II, we couldn't just ignore the Germans because, it was going to cost too much to fight the war. The longer you put off fighting the battle, the more the battle's going to cost you. And I think that's what we've really seen come to fruition here. Living in denial and, acting like this is just going to take care of itself is a big reason why we're in this position right now. I mean, we could have had a major Ebola outbreak in the U.S., back when it was threatening. There's been other potential pandemics that didn't come to fruition, but we've always been very proactive about fighting that. And that's what we need to examine, when this is all said and done. But to your point, the economy will not rebound unless we're able to re-inject confidence about this whole situation. And that's going to take getting this thing under control. And like you said, pushing things out until we can come up with a vaccine that will give us confidence that we're not going to fall right back into this.
So there are about 35 companies in academic institutions that are, competing to create a vaccine. One press report said that at least 4 of them already have candidates where they've been testing the vaccines in animals. And, there's a biotech firm called Moderna. I believe there was a firm called Gilead that's working on vaccines or working on treatments. I was at a political conference, actually, Republican political conference a few months ago, the RGA. I kind of laugh because I'm a Democrat, but, in the context of supporting clean energy policies, we want to get buy-in from both Republicans and Democrats. And so I was at the Republican Governors Association meeting, and I got to meet one of the representatives of Gilead. They're a pharmaceutical firm, and they're working on solutions. So, it's amazing. You have 35 companies working on this. I believe I read a report that Bill Gates is actually building out the factories to develop these vaccines, and he's building out different factories to fulfill the production of different vaccines, knowing that a bunch of them aren't going to be selected. So that's just billions of dollars that he's going to write off because he wants to be able to build up the capacity so that we can get the most vaccines out at the fastest rate possible. That's somebody that we should put the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation in charge of the pandemic. They've been on this issue.
Right.
They've been on this issue for years globally, dealing with malaria and the issue of hygiene through clean water and toilet systems. There's a great documentary on Netflix with Bill Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that talks about their development of a standalone toilet system that promotes human hygiene, that saves, hundreds of thousands of lives. Some things as simple as clean water and electricity on a global scale makes such massive impacts. He's been accustomed to deploying capital in an efficient way through his NGO to get outcomes and results. And, that's really what we need right now.
Mm-hmm.
I know that, Tom, you and I have something in common, even beyond the introductory remarks that shows how intertwined we are. But your wife, LaDonna, happens to be a sitting state representative in the Missouri legislature. And my wife, Vicki England, is a former legislator, and she happens to be the Democratic nominee for state treasurer for Missouri.
Yep.
And I've seen firsthand how this economic pause and stay-at-home order has impacted the political realm. But, I was reading recently that the United States Supreme Court just voted to deny Wisconsin's request to extend absentee voting.
Right.
So tomorrow they're going to be conducting a primary in Wisconsin. Tell me a little bit about what you've seen LaDonna doing in terms of dealing with this extraordinary historical case of economic shutdown and how it impacts real world politics.
Right. Yeah. So it has been very interesting. It's been a very interesting perspective, watching what she's had to go through. But, to your earlier points about certain segments living in denial, she was in the legislature and they were gaming it out. It was right when some of the stay-at-home orders were going into effect, and they had a constitutional duty to pass a budget. They offered up amendments to automatically have access to emergency funding to help deal with this crisis, and all those amendments were voted down by the Republican majority. So as a result, she's got to go back to Jefferson City tomorrow to vote on getting access to some of this emergency funding. Now, it's a pretty dynamic situation, but that was an extremely frustrating part of this. Is here we have the legislators. They were trying to prepare, and you had some of them that you can only imagine for strictly political reasons and messaging reasons, voting to not get access to emergency funding to help Missouri better prepare for what everybody knew was coming. That part was frustrating, but and then she had a couple of people that were in the Capitol that wound up testing positive. So the Capitol's, as you know, Byron's a very public space. You go out there to visit it on a normal day, and you've got the halls, packed with people. Everything from school kids to
anti-vaccination activists.
Exactly.
I mean, I remember last year when I was advocating for clean energy in the Capitol, someone was telling me, one of the legislators was telling me about how they react to the anti-vaccination activists when they come in. They get out the hand sanitizer and squirt all the microphones and tabletops and desks and stuff. I mean, where is that going now? Where's the anti-vaccination activism going now?
Yeah.
I mean,
and where's the hand sanitizer? Because that's at a premium now.
Yeah, I know, you can't buy it anymore.
Right. But it's like you have you got all the people that work at the Capitol, then you have all the people that show up to the Capitol that are members of the public that some of them want to lobby for their pet project. It could be anyone from nurses to teachers to, like you said, anti-vaxxers. So it's a very public space, and because of that, a global pandemic hits, and they cut down on the public access, but still it makes you wonder. So, but yeah, she's heading back tomorrow to help deal with this stuff. The governor's been putting in executive orders, and it's been piecemeal. Like you said, he finally issued a statewide stay-at-home order, but there's still a number of exemptions. You still have to be concerned about some of the rural areas. We've watched as over 10 rural hospitals have shut down because we failed to expand Medicaid in Missouri.
It's unbelievable. We've rejected hundreds of millions of dollars of support for Missouri Health from the federal government, a commitment that's established in law. We've rejected that just to support some sort of rejection of Barack Obama.
Exactly. And I mean, they're talking about tens of thousands of healthcare working jobs that would go to support these hospitals that, access to medical care is a part of the equation when you talk about your quality of healthcare. Some of these rural areas, it doesn't matter how good your insurance is. If you got to drive 2 hours to get to a trauma center, that's bad news. Now, and likewise, we're looking at a global pandemic. If it starts spreading out in rural Missouri, those patients are going to have to go somewhere. So they're going to have to go to the population centers that have the hospital capacity to care for them. It's a bad situation if things really start getting spread out there. And, Missouri is a fairly densely populated state. When you get out into some of the rural areas, for the most part, it's relatively densely populated, compared to some other states. So yeah, it's a situation that is unnecessarily bad. And for reasons that really shouldn't be political, but in this day and age, really kind of are.
So I know you're an attorney for St. Louis County, and St. Louis County is about 1 million folks. It's separate from St. Louis City, which is about 310,000 folks. There's a political separation between the city and the county, and that's an anachronistic historical remainder from the Civil War. That's a whole other story.
Right.
It's called the Great Divorce. But so you're a county attorney, and obviously you've been processing and metabolizing a bunch of inquiries about what's happening with the stay-at-home order and the coronavirus crisis. I'm curious, have you seen just some perspectives that are a little hard to compartmentalize because they're just so far off the mark that, for me, I've just seen a increase in conspiracy theories. And, you have this 5G conspiracy theory about, the telecommunications technology, 5G, that allows for faster transfer speeds, etc. There's some former professor from the Washington State University or something that was commenting on this 6-7 months ago, and so this has been extrapolated. I think Woody Harrelson put an Instagram post about I really don't know what this means, but hey, I'm flagging this for everybody, and then of course it replicates like its own form of pandemic. Its own an epidemic of fake news. But then you see some videos of supposed 5G towers that have been lit on fire and this kind of stuff. And we commented a little bit on why conspiracy theories provide comfort for folks that feel vulnerable and traumatized, and in particular by globally impactful events that just seem so massively influential on their lives and what the future is going to be. And yet the explanation is what? A virus from a bat hopped to some weird scaled animal and then hopped to a human, and then it spread in Wuhan, China, and then that's it. That's the explanation. That's not as exotic enough of an explanation to understand why all the restaurants are shut down, all the traffic's been shut down. 90% of the airline traffic out of New York's been shut down. That's not an exotic enough explanation. It doesn't provide comfort. So if you can gravitate towards some sort of global conspiracy theory, well, this is a biological weapon. It's been designed by the Illuminati. And they're interested. Obviously, I don't want to, put you over your skis in terms of your role as a legal representative for the county. But could you talk a little bit about, some of the thinking that surrounds this crisis and how it really pushes the boundaries and the envelope of the extremities?
Right. Sure. And then, obviously I'm not here as like a representative of the county or anything like that, but I actually do work, and I was brought on to work on issues regarding transparency and public access to information. And it's immediately apparent when you start delving into that to any level at all, that there's always this like tension, right, between a public's right to know and potential of misinformation getting out there, potential of violating other people's privacy rights. It's interesting. It's a little bit of a tightrope to walk there.
Let me interrupt you. So you say it's a bit of a tightrope to walk, and I think that's a critical thing right there. Because you have the Trump administration, and in particular, the way President Trump has done his ascendancy, so to speak. And it's really based on a kind of say whatever is on your mind, kind of blurting out political rhetoric. You just say whatever's on your mind, and that's what, that's the way it is. And then, Jared Kushner, the administration went full Jared. So Jared says whatever's on his mind, that the federal stockpile is for us and the state stockpiles are for everybody else. And so then all of a sudden you have these official resources, these online resources backfill Jared saying, oh, well, the federal government is to operate in a supportive capacity to the states. And they have to rewrite, they have to backfill what he's saying. But, I think that it's really important to emphasize that communicators that have power, that are actually governing, their words have real impacts. And that and that when they hedge and equivocate, like walking on a tightrope, This is what politicians engage in because it's important, because restraint in the context of wielding power is critical. And I think that this say whatever you think brand of blurting irresponsibly that the president has popularized, I mean, I consider this to be a dangerous cultural trend that needs to be repudiated, because we need to bring back thoughtful, responsible communication, even equivocation and restraint. And there's a reason why politicians just don't think extemporaneously and say whatever's on their mind, because it impacts the whole body politic.
Right. Yeah. And as an attorney, and having to look at some of this stuff, I mean, we'll get information requests, and I'll give you a real great brief example here. Right at the onset of this whole global pandemic, before things were really ramping up, and it seems like an eternity ago, but it really wasn't that long ago. There was an incident where it came out that a father had brought his daughter to a father-daughter dance, and they were waiting to get the test results back from his other daughter. And there was a big controversy as to whether or not they should have quarantined themselves at home. And now a lot of people were interested in that. A lot of people were very upset that this father had, made a decision that could have impacted lots of people, and, decided the way he did. People wanted to know about that, but what were the privacy rights of that daughter and of that family? And, where's the balance there? I mean, people wanted to know about it. The media wanted to report on it, but, you have HIPAA, you have all these other issues. Would it have been very prudent for a media source to report on that, knowing the public backlash that they might get? I mean, I don't know. That's part of the tension that we wind up having to deal with. So you've got people that are, they have their own healthcare issues that they're dealing with, but it interfaces directly with a pandemic that affects everybody.
Well, people are going to want to know if you have the virus.
Right.
And that's going to translate into intrusive technology. I mean, this is going to raise civil liberties issues.
Absolutely.
I mean, restaurants are taking the temperatures of people.
Mm-hmm.
What civil liberties do you see being raised here? I mean, I don't suspect that you're looking at the overarching, kind of social, cultural, socioeconomic, sociocultural impact in your role as county attorney. But, do you see, this is a topic that we raised in my first episode with James, which was civil liberties. And, James mentioned, well, during the Civil War, Lincoln paused habeas corpus, which is a Latin phrase, which means present the body, which means that you have certain disclosure responsibilities whenever you bring somebody to trial, that you have to, show cause about why they're actually standing before a court in trial. So, and yet we reverted, after, and I think that that's one of the more unexplored periods of American history, because when you look at the Reconstruction period, where the entire South was carved up into 5 different federal districts for over a decade. I mean, that was a pretty intense period of American history of martial law and military jurisdiction over Americans. But,
Right.
How do you see, you deal with the HIPAA law now in your job, how do you see some of the options or results of where this is going to leave us in terms of data privacy?
Yeah. I mean, with the technology being what it is, I mean, I think a lot of people have heard about these thermometers that if somebody's spiking a fever, it'll basically ping back to a host, and they can track fevers almost like a weather pattern. I envision something like that taking root in one form or another, and then you have to ask yourself: is that, at this point, that is considered anonymous data? Will it remain anonymous? I mean, if they start, if they are able to track people's temperatures, when they spike a fever, and so they're alerted. You know, will that remain anonymous? And if not, what's the implication for that? You already have border checkpoints in Texas to stop people from coming in from Louisiana. Because
I believe troopers in Rhode Island are looking at out-of-state license plates and pulling those folks over and, saying, hey, do you know that there's a stay-at-home order? Where are you coming from? Have you been to Wuhan, China?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's, these are the type of things, I mean, it's similar to after 9/11, when they started looking at, it was balancing security versus civil rights. And as an attorney, I happen to like civil rights. I think civil liberties it's not something that you should discard lightly, even though we've been traumatized as a society to the level that we have.
We're paying a price for the freedoms that we have as a society in terms of being able to respond to this crisis. I mean, you look at how China responded, where in an authoritarian, totalitarian way, they just shut down everybody. And
right.
They have the capacity to do that. So it's really a question of like it's a baby bathwater issue, right? Do we want to throw away our civil liberties and freedoms to be able to have the capacity to reduce our casualties to say, 30,000 victims of coronavirus crisis versus 100,000 victims of a coronavirus crisis. So is that delta of 70,000 victims? I mean, this is terribly dispassionate and callous about how we're looking at numbers. But, as policymakers, you have to really look at those numbers. Does 70,000 victims justify overturning the tradition of the mavericky degree of independence and freedom that America has? I mean, that's really what you have to look at.
Yeah, and I think that you got to get pretty granular with it too. I mean, because part of the problem is that when you make a policy and you enact that policy through the rules or laws, it's a one-size-fits-all solution, right? You don't want to get yourself into a false choice situation where you kind of look at it like it's all or nothing. I mean, there's certain measures that will certainly be taken to deal with the potential of this happening again. And some of them will be really good. They'll make a lot of sense. Some of them will kind of be like, well, hey, if doing whatever it is will help even just a little bit, we're gonna go ahead and make that sacrifice and do it. But there's always a cost-benefit analysis that has to be employed here. You see that a lot in certain laws, like Missouri Sunshine Law. It states right up front that it's about transparency and access to data. But by the same token, sometimes that results in people losing a little bit of privacy on that end, because if you do anything with a government entity, you lose a little bit of that privacy. Like for instance, people can report a business to the county that they think is violating the stay-at-home order and is a non-essential business that's still open. Well, if you report that, there's a disclaimer right on the form that lets you know that report becomes a public record with the government, and therefore somebody can find out through a sunshine request. And some people will say, I want to remain anonymous. We can't do that because it's all about transparency.
So you think about the impact moving forward. I mean, I understand that right now in this week, as the Surgeon General expressed, this is a 9/11 Pearl Harbor moment for our country, because we're seeing, over 1,000 Americans die every single day. And the way they're dying is completely tragic and horrific. They're dying in isolation. They don't have access to their family. In many cases they're sedated and intubated on the respirators, and it's just really it's horrific. I mean, it's literally the plague. It's a biblical plague. And obviously, taking that into consideration, perhaps it's premature to think about where we're going to be downfield. But one of the most pressing questions that I think is going to come up is the tension in densification for urban areas. Is there going to be a push for cities to be less concentrated. Because recently there's been a push for cities to become more concentrated to improve environmental sustainability.
Right.
But after the coronavirus crisis, are we going to disaggregate and separate populations? Which is one of the key tools right now, obviously, in the Fabian strategy to backpedal and to prepare the battlefield for which we want to fight on, which is, flattening the curve, et cetera, which we've discussed earlier. But, so there's this conflict between public health and mitigating climate change.
Right. And I mean, that question's the landscape of that question is going to be shifting based on what happens with the numbers. Because, right now the epicenter is definitely New York and some other urban areas and some of the more densely populated areas. But I think that we're going to see some of the numbers proliferate in some areas that wouldn't be considered actually really dense areas as well. But I think that when you think about this strategically, this could call for kind of a reinvestment in some of our urban areas to address some of the issues. It might be a little bit of a trade-off. You got to think about some of the potential technologies that could be used in an urban area to help track and limit the spread of something like this. Because what really caught us on our heels with this was our lack of ability to track the spread and deal with it
Testing.
Testing. And so it's like if you know where things are starting to, if there's community spread starting in a certain area, you lock down that area. It's like we let the fire spread way too far before we started fighting the fire. If you start fighting the fire when it's just a little flare up here and there, you're going to have much better odds of getting in front of it. And I think that would be a lot more possible in an urban type setting as opposed to more spread out, exurban or suburban type scenario. But so now here we are, we had to clamp down on everything. But there's a little bit of a tension there when it comes to broader concerns that may have to take a back seat when you start talking about a global pandemic. I know that they don't allow reusable grocery bags anymore. My wife went to the grocery store and was really kind of stocking up because we want to limit our number of trips to the grocery store. And I swear she brought back 40 bags, plastic bags with the groceries. And I just shook my head because they probably all could have fit in just a few reusable bags. But this is the horizon that we need to kind of start keeping our eye on because there will be some things that are going to fall out from this, and we need to think about being smart policy wise and not be reactionary to the trauma that we've just gone through as a nation. And I think that's going to take a lot of thought. It's going to take a lot of conversations, and it's going to take hopefully a more of a long game look at things that isn't colored by some sort of political bent, because this clearly shouldn't be something that is colored by our politics and partisanship.
Thomas Friedman has been talking about some sort of unity government to deal with this crisis. I mean, I don't know if we're going to arrive there.
Right.
Do you think we're going to have an election in November?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that's one of those things where people need to look at this in terms of elections are supremely important, and unfortunately, I think it's going to be a fight. I think some of the people that were initially calling this a hoax are going to be pushing back on doing things to make our votes safer, more accessible. But it certainly needs to be.
I've heard that the issue of mail-in voting is sort of off the table in Missouri, which is shocking to me. But as you know,
right.
There's a tendency, sadly, for the GOP to basically want to reduce the amount of folks that have access to the ballot box. And, the Democrats want to see the voice of the people be heard.
Right.
That's really to describe the trends that have occurred in terms of voter caging and attempts to, create onerous voter ID laws and things like this. That's the political line in the sand that's been drawn. We are going to litigate the way that this administration has dealt with the coronavirus crisis. It may not be appropriate to litigate it right now because we're like the Surgeon General said, in a 9/11 Pearl Harbor moment. But, there were warnings. The president was warned. And the president said, recently this was something that nobody thought that could ever even happen to this country. We're doing things that nobody's ever done before. And it's like, that's your job. Your job is to deal with the problems that aren't easily solved. This is how Barack Obama described the job. He said that the sad thing about being president is that the issues that arrive at his desk are the issues that nobody else could solve before him. So they're the really gnarly issues. Well, guess what? You asked for the job and you've got a gnarly issue on your table, and you need to wrap your arms around this and embrace the science. But that doesn't seem to be what's happening. There just seems to be a tendency to want to point fingers at the fake news and to blame the Inspector General of the HHS and et cetera. That's what seems to be going on right now.
Absolutely.
But we are going to get through this, and I believe, that we will have an election in November, contrary to what some people are saying. And I think that the way that the administration has handled this crisis will be up front and center in that election.
Absolutely. This was a real test of leadership, and by every and any metric, I think we've seen the exact opposite of the correct way of handling something like this.
Thank you for listening to Intention. This podcast can be found where podcasts reside. Please subscribe, and we'll be talking again soon.